You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to this week's Campus podcast. I'm Moran, your host and editor of Campus, which, for those of you who don't know, is Times Higher Education's platform where academics and university staff can share practical advice on different elements of working in higher ed. So, this week we're discussing student support and safety. Now, anyone who's been a student or worked in a university will know that fantastic teaching is just one element in a range of factors that enable students to excel. Most students attend university at a very formative period in their lives. It's that strange place somewhere between teenagerdom and adulthood. And even for more mature students, it often represents a crossroads or a turning point in their lives. So while this is really exciting, it also brings challenges, risks. People can feel very insecure and vulnerable. People are suddenly untethered from their previous routines and community, family, and obviously learning all sorts of new things. So universities have a real duty of care to look after everyone within their communities. And at best, this is making students feel welcome, supported, secure. But at the more serious end of the spectrum, it can mean protecting them from harassment, prejudice, even their own mental health struggles. Today, we're looking at both these sides of student support and safeguarding. So we are speaking to Rachel Fenton, a professor in law at the University of Exeter, and one of the UK's leading academic experts in gender-based violence and sexual misconduct. We also spoke to Catherine Moran, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Academic at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, where she leads the university's teaching and learning strategy and oversees academic achievement. So first, Rachel. Now, she was one of the leading figures behind England's first evidence-based bystander intervention programme, designed to prevent sexual and domestic violence in universities. And this was called the Intervention Initiative, which we will hear more about shortly. Rachel has since been called on to advise universities all over the world and many other organisations. She's featured widely across mainstream media, things like BBC Women's Hour, talking on this subject. She now provides bystander intervention training through her spin-out company called Kindling Interventions. So, given the Office for Students have now felt it imperative upon them to introduce new compulsory regulations for universities relating to the handling of sexual misconduct, I wanted to find out what can really make a difference. Hi Rachel, thanks for taking the time today to discuss a very serious and problematic issue for universities, but also society as a whole. Now, you've done a huge amount of research into the prevention of violence against women, sexual offences and bystander intervention. What got you interested in these areas of law?
I was interested in sexual offences because I've been teaching criminal law for quite a while, and an opportunity arose with Public Health England. It was back in about 2013 to look at the evidence around prevention, particularly using the bystander response, which hadn't at that point been looked at in the UK as a prevention initiative. So we put together an interdisciplinary team, and we were successful with Public Health England in getting that tender. And really, it's just sort of spiraled exponentially from that point. So, I mean, a lot of a lot of gratitude has to go to Public Health England, I think, for where we've got to with bystander intervention, because they funded that kind of initial piece of work. So initial bit of work was a literature review looking at what works in terms of universities and this bystander approach, and to create a particular toolkit, which we call an actual intervention, which became the intervention initiative, and to make that prevention programme be based on the best evidence out there at that particular moment in time. So that's kind of where it originated, and has gone from strength to strength since then.
Based on your research on sexual and gender-based violence, can you give us an idea of the scale of the problem in UK universities today?
So what we know is that it is the biggest global public health concern for women in the world, and it is a significant public health concern in the UK generally, in the general population. We know that young women are particularly at risk, and universities are really specific sites where violence against women takes place, and it does take place on quite a significant scale. You know, there have been quite a few surveys. The surveys began in around 2010, 2011 with work done by the NUS, and there has been quite a few surveys since then. The most recent data, I think, is probably from the pilot survey done by the OFS. And I can give you some examples of the kind of scale that we're talking about. And this is from a sample size of about, I think it's 3,000 students, and it's not at every university. I think the idea really was to pilot how the survey would work. But to give you an idea, 61% of students experience some form of sexual harassment at university, 70% of that within university settings, of which 76% of cases men were perpetrators, and over a third of students experienced unwanted sexual contact. So we're talking about sexual assault now, and 1 in 20 experienced rape or attempted rape. So you can see that if you think about how many university students there are, so you think about populations in individual universities as being, 10, 20, 30,000 students, that is a lot of students. That is a lot of sexual harassment. It's a lot of sexual violence. Okay. And this survey also found that 3/4 of survivors had their lives impacted by that. So the numbers are really, really high, and that is only a snapshot. Okay. One of the problems that we've had in this country is that nobody has done a proper national survey on prevalence to find out exactly what the prevalence rate is. But what we do know, if you think about society as a whole and how we've moved perhaps over the last 5 or 6 years, with everyone's invited, me too, all of these different avenues where women have begun to speak out, we see and we hear about the experiences of women, on a daily basis, whether they are students, whether they're working women, whether they are children in school, and those numbers are massive. So it is a really significant problem, not just for universities, but within society as a whole.
Those figures are terrifying.
Yeah, they are. They're terrifying and not surprising, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that we're hearing those qualitative voices now that women are speaking out, and that it's everywhere. It is everywhere. It's that simple.
Yeah, those figures are stark in the message they purvey, but I know at a kind of societal level that underreporting is generally the problem where sexual harassment, sexual violence is concerned. How accurate do you think these figures are for universities, given they are a snapshot?
I think there's certainly a risk that it may be even higher. I mean, this is a 15-minute survey. Okay, so I think that when we look at some of the prevalence surveys that have been developed elsewhere, they are much bigger and longer surveys, and the sample wasn't representative. So although they had an eye on the demographics, it wasn't a representative sample, and the number was 3,000. Okay, and it was only piloted in a sort of handful of universities. So I think as a snapshot, it's really interesting. But what needs to happen now at scale is there needs to be a uniform method of survey and data collection. And I'm not entirely sure, but I imagine that is the purpose of the pilot that the OFS have done, is that they will make the tool or use the tool across universities. And of course, it's always going to be dependent on who fills it in and at what stage of their university lives they fill it in. But certainly we know it's underreported. We know that's in terms of formal reporting. So we've seen increases in reporting. I think a lot of that is because we're talking about it more on a general societal basis. Since Me Too, there's much more historical reporting coming through to the police, for example. And we keep seeing that, don't we? In the news, there's at the moment we've got Al Fayed, and the immense scale of just that one person and those experiences coming out now. So, and there's something like that happens every year or every couple of years, that show the extent of this in women's lives, whether or not that's, now or whether it's been in the past. So there is an increase in reporting in terms of historic to the police. We can't really tell much about reporting to universities because it depends on the individual university. So in this particular survey done by the OFS, about a third of students didn't seek any support for the more serious sexual offences. A third of those said that they felt ashamed. They didn't think it was serious enough. And even if it is reported, you can't really take reporting to universities as being as a reliable indicator, because reporting can mean that a university is doing really well in publicising, as it should be, the policies and processes and the support for students that's out there. So more people should report if you have good processes. So if a university is saying, oh, this doesn't happen here, look, because we don't have any reporting, you can tell, likelihood it's that nobody feels able to report because they don't see or think that they'll be dealt with fairly or safely, or that they can get any support from the university in the first place.
Wow, yes, that's a very good point, that the figures can be very misleading if not looked at with quite a critical eye. I know you led a hugely influential project, which you've already referenced, the Intervention Initiative. I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about this and what impact it's had 8 years on from its creation.
Yeah, so the Intervention Initiative was the first evidence-led bystander programme for universities in England and Wales. And it is, in a nutshell, it's an 8-hour programme to be delivered in 2-hour blocks over time. And it's designed by myself and Dr. Helen Mott, and it was absolutely designed to be cumulative, so to be done over time, so that each session builds into each session, and take students through the psychological processes required for becoming an active bystander. So those stages are that you have to notice and have knowledge of the event. So that's around, can you tell what behaviours are problematic? Can you understand the risk factors, the attitudes and beliefs about women? For example, can you understand the myths, sort of what we call rape myths? Can you look at your own gender and critical insight into your own kind of behaviour and belief systems? Can you be empowered to take responsibility for realizing this is a problem in society, and it's a problem that affects very, very many women and girls and some men and boys? Do you feel confident and motivated? So can we increase that confidence and motivation to be able to intervene? Can we understand the social norms that operate around us that either empower us to make interventions or make sure that we feel too scared, too worried about saying anything? And then finally, I think the key is that you put in skills practice. So we put in 2 hours of skills practice, looking at examples and how you might make a bystander intervention when you see those kind of risk factors, when you see sexual harassment, and when there is a potential for something even more serious to be occurring. So, the potential or the vulnerability around potential rape or sexual assault. So it's a long program based on best evidence, and what's really interesting is that at the time, Public Health England wrote to the government, and then 4 government departments wrote to all vice-chancellors in the country asking them to look at it and to take it up. So that was back in about 2016. It might have even been earlier than that, to be honest with you. It could have been 2015. And we published alongside that the extensive literature review, the logic model behind the intervention, all the facilitator notes, all the slides, and we worked with, stakeholders, we worked with student body, etc., to kind of get that as good as it could be at that particular moment in history. And that was a free resource as well. So there's no cost to that. It's a free resource for all universities to potentially adopt. We then went on to evaluate that, again, funded by Public Health England, and actually the University of the West of England co-funded that. And we found significant results across a range of measures. So that was a rigorous academic evaluation. And we found that it was feasible to stick it in the curriculum. So to actually embed it within the curriculum for first year students. And I think that's a really, really important point. So that was the first bit of work. And because it was a free resource, it's out there, it's still out there. It hasn't been updated since then. I'll just put that in as a caveat, but it's still out there. And the evidence behind it is still absolutely valid. And the impact has been not in a way as good as we'd have liked it to be, because certainly all universities haven't taken it up, but it has had impact in the sense that it's provided a model. And here's the downside. What many universities have done, and this is, we see this in some of the surveys and the what have universities done question, is because it's been put online, but with no quality controls, because we're not able to control what universities have done with that. Very many universities, perhaps they've taken an hour out of it, or they've done, they've taken a couple of exercises out of it and they've put together a 1-hour program or something like that, and then said that they're providing bystander intervention in a way that it was never designed to do. So yes, so yes, we can say it's definitely had an impact. And the OFS, when they put out catalyst funding for universities in about 2017, 2018, they set aside a lot of money in the millions for universities to do certain things. And one of those was, if they are going to do bystander, then to use this model. But subsequent survey that we did, this was myself, Catherine Donovan from Durham, Khadija Chantler from MMU, and Kelly Bracewell from UCLan. We did a survey talking to people working specifically in this field across universities, and we talked to the both quants and qualitative people working specifically on the ground trying to do this work in different universities. And what we found was that most universities, when they had used that model, and it was the dominant model being used, they had either added in other content, so it wasn't just about violence against women anymore, and they had made it shorter. So there are questions that raises, obviously, around, and this is probably the big thing that I'm going to say today, really, is that if you want to make a difference, and anything that is actually impactful is going to cost money. It's not going to be cheap. And the first question should not be, how can I do this cheaper, right? So it's had an impact. I would like to see more impact, really. And I am confident to say that it really makes a difference. And I know that from years of facilitating and designing programs, both for other universities within the sector. So we've done some subsequent work. We've got updates to what was the intervention initiative for different sort of updated with the latest evidence, and that's under the guise of Kindling Transformative Interventions, which is a spin-out company from the University of Exeter, and from other studies that we have carried out looking at the bystander approach for violence against women and girls in different settings outside universities. So we've done work within communities, we've worked a lot with football and sports, with adults, we've worked in workplaces, and we've done several new evaluations. And I guess it's a constant iterative learning process about how do we make these trainings, absolutely effective as they can be. And that work has continued, as I said, through this other vehicle, if you like. It's a different vehicle.
I want to go back to this initial training package. From what you do know, because you said you did very much then study its effect and the results coming out of it, what impact does it have? What do you see from students or academics and university staff who go through this training program?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, and the results that we found within the student program, the intervention initiative, we very much found in our other studies as well, out in the sort of different non-university settings. So the first is around feasibility and acceptability, i.e., if you give the program to people, will they like it? Will they come back? Will they enjoy it? So we would measure that through self-reported feedback measures, and they are and have been absolutely consistently either 4 or 5 out of 5, with 5 being excellent, and that is across the board. Okay, so we can say that the bystander approach is really popular, and it's really popular with participants because it situates responsibility within everybody, and everybody within having a role to play in the community. So it's very much about talking to people as, active bystanders who aren't directly involved. They're not being accused of anything. They're not the perpetrator. They're not being victimized, but they really understand those links between, the cultural things that happen, the myths that there are about that, the victim blaming that we see, and they can see how that can lead to far more serious events, like rape, sexual assault. Yeah. So when people can really understand all those connections, it makes them want to say, that's not all right. Or have you thought about what that means when you're talking about this? Have you thought about, correcting the myths that they hear? So really changing people's attitudes and beliefs, particularly around victim blaming, I would say, and rape myths. So then the measures in terms of the academic psychometrics, we're looking at, can you change people's attitudes and beliefs, and using validated scales to check that. So we would look at, for example, can we reduce people's rape myth acceptance? And the answer to that has been yes, and that it can be sustained at follow-up, both at post and at follow-up. Do people feel more willing to intervene? Are they more confident? And again, we found significant results in many of the studies that people feel there's definite significant increase in their confidence to intervene. And do they actually change their behavior? Okay, which is really hard to measure. Yeah, and you need to measure that over time, because if you try to measure that at the point of post, you haven't necessarily given people the chance to make any interventions, because they have to be in a situation where they can actually make an intervention. So with the intervention initiative, we didn't have the funding to do a follow-up, but with subsequent studies, we have been able to do follow-up, including one study was a 9-month follow-up. And what we found in that study, and this is with community members, was that not only did they get better at post, they carried on getting better, and we could see behavioural change. So, it's really also really important to say that, qualitative is a better way of capturing that kind of behavioural change. But absolutely, I would say that the impact of the training is a real thing. And I can say that through Kindling, we have trained, 3,000 people, I would say, in the last year and a half. That might be an underestimation, actually, as well as the work that I've done facilitating in universities. And you can see those light bulb moments. Yeah. So I'll give you an example of a light bulb moment. You can see that if you work with young men and you talk about sort of the social norms with them, and then how they might be impeded from saying anything, and how when they do, that person may go on to commit more serious sexual offences. That's a light bulb moment for thinking, gosh, I might be complicit, and actually, this is something that I need to do something about. And really understanding those connections between sexism and misogyny and victim blaming, and understanding what those risk factors are that are evident, and then feeling empowered to be able to say, actually, I did not realize that when I laugh at that rape joke, or when I go along with sexist behavior, when I see sexual harassment occur and I don't do anything, what I'm actually doing is empowering that person who wants to take it further to take it further. And that is a significant light bulb moment. The thing is that to do that level of work is expensive. You cannot do that level of work with people on a tick box, 40-minute online course. And that's the problem. When it fundamentally comes down to it, why didn't universities adopt it, at the time when they could have? Number one would be resource, I think, alongside, the kind of head in the sand, it's not really a problem. It doesn't happen in our university. Being badly informed and being fearful of reputation as well, reputational damage.
I know the Office for Students has introduced new rules for universities relating to sexual harassment and misconduct, and I'm sure that this programme fed into their decision and the way that they have framed these rules. These are, for instance, requiring training for staff and students, requiring published information about policies and procedures that these universities have in place, and of course banning of non-disclosure agreements. What do you make of these measures by the OFS? Do you think they will help?
I think they will help, and I'm going to just perhaps run through a little bit of the history. So in 2016, University UK published guidance about what universities should be doing, and taking up, of which bystander intervention was one part of that, alongside prevalence, working out what's going on in student culture, prevalence and proper training, and making sure that staff are properly trained, as well as the bystander work for students, right? So that's been out there since 2016 of this is what should be happening. Then we had the sort of all the catalyst funding. Now, what we found in the survey, the national survey that I did with my colleagues, is that universities who received catalyst funding, for example, were reporting that when the funding ran out after a year or so, it wasn't embedded. So the lack of funding at that point was leading that to be a problem. So the survey that we did, and the OFS did a survey as well to see what the sort of state of play was around 2019, 2020. And they found that it was very, very piecemeal. We all found it was extremely piecemeal. So you had some universities who hadn't even opened the agenda and were just, in total denial. And you had other universities, notably where they had senior champions and or academics working in the field, had done quite a lot. So you had a sort of a qualitatively different experience going on for students in different universities, totally piecemeal, which wasn't acceptable. So the OFS then released a statement of expectations, and they were expectations with no teeth. And it's basically the same things that are now becoming a condition of registration, which you've pretty much outlined, which is making the information and the processes and the support really, really visible, training for students, and training that will make a significant and credible difference, doing prevalence surveys, reducing the likelihood and protecting students, and doing something to make a credible and significant difference to abuse of power in staff-student relationships. So those are kind of the main tenets of it. What I would say is that they come into force next August, and the reason they are now part of the conditions of registration is because universities didn't act on the statement of expectations, which I was talking to my colleague earlier, and I was saying, I feel that I've been saying the same things almost for the last 8 to 10 years, and I'm absolutely not the only academic working in this field who has been saying the same things. And it's really disappointing that it's taken to get to this point where it now has to be a condition of registration, because the universities have not acted, and it is that simple. And the language is really interesting as well. I don't think it's necessarily perfect, but it's a really good start. It talks about, certainly in terms of the training, it says it must be underpinned by credible evidence, and effectiveness must be evaluated, and designed and delivered by persons with credible and demonstrable expertise.
Given that university resources are extremely stretched, the prioritisation of where those resources are spent is incredibly important.
Yeah.
What, in your view, are the most important things that universities need to do to better protect their students and their staff?
Certainly for me, evidence-based bystander program is really important. And by that, I mean courses that are bespoke, that are designed by experts, i.e. experts who have academic credibility in the area, not necessarily by private providers who cannot show that. And there are ways to do that at scale, and there are ways to think about different levels of training. Like, is there something to be done at scale that is less time consuming or less expensive, with a certain proportion of students getting much more in-person kind of bespoke training? What about senior management? My experience is also as somebody who delivers bystander training for boards of directors in big organizations, that senior management training is a really important piece. That's of course not mentioned in this guideline. What does it mean? They talk very much about not having it as voluntary or optional. It should be mandatory. But how do you put thousands and thousands of students through a cost-effective training? If you want to do a rigorous academic evaluation, that costs money, and we're talking quite a lot of money. So I'm just wondering where that kind of funding is going to come from. But yes, my message absolutely would be, it has to be evidence-based, and credibility should be academic credibility sustained by proper evaluation and proper measures. I also think one of the things that isn't mentioned, well, let's say what it does mention. So the OFS do talk about making sure that staff know where that information is, and that staff are trained particularly in disclosure, and that they have specialist staff for the investigatory and adjudicatory processes when they go actually through that disciplinary process, and that's going to be really important. But they don't talk about bystander for staff. Now, I would say bystander for staff is really, really important, because those attitudes and beliefs are going to be just as prevalent within staff populations as they are in student populations, and they are kind of across society as a whole. And that kind of training is going to equip staff to look at other staff behaviours, to really realise when there are risks and behaviours that are not appropriate. And if you look at the survey data from the pilot survey, we learned that 1 in 10 students had an intimate relationship with a university staff member in the last year, of whom 35% felt pressured into it, and that 1 in 6 students were pressured by staff into an intimate relationship. And so just equipping staff to take a disclosure from a student isn't enough, in my opinion. More training is required, and I think the bystander approach would be really, really valuable for staff. My message would always be, if you're in doubt, bring in the experts, because there are a lot of experts, and work with external bodies, work with rape crisis, work with the SARCs, work with the academics that you've got, and think about what will actually be effective.
That is all important messaging for anyone listening to this. Thank you so much for speaking to me today, Rachel.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Rachel's message is very clear. In her view, universities have been far too slow in addressing this incredibly widespread problem, despite repeated warnings and requests to do so. And now they have essentially been given an ultimatum. So I guess we have to hope the resulting actions and measures do actually bring down incidences of sexual violence or misconduct across the sector. Now, for my colleague Eliza's interview with Catherine, she focused on how the University of Canterbury in Christchurch approaches student support in order to maximise the chances of success for all their students. There are lots of useful takeaways here for institutions on how best to manage support services, which, given the multiple pressures today's students are under, seems more important than ever. Canterbury also has unique experience in caring for students in fairly extreme circumstances, having been hit by earthquakes in 2010 and 11, with the latter really devastating areas of Christchurch. And that is something my colleague Eliza asked Catherine about.
Hi, Catherine, and welcome to the Times Higher Education podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start off by asking, what are students' biggest reasons for seeking pastoral care at the moment?
It's interesting. So there are a number of reasons that students seek pastoral care, and we are always looking ourselves into those reasons, what driving students to seek support. We run a survey, actually, a student voice survey at the beginning of every year. And we always ask as part of that survey to understand students, what their issues are, what's making them think about leaving. So we do a survey. Some students who have just started university 6 weeks in will start thinking about leaving. What is it that's making students think about leaving? What are their experiences around well-being? What are their experiences around the student services we provide? And also, what kinds of experiences are they having in terms of discrimination or other kinds of experiences around the culture? And that's been really insightful. Most of the times when students come to see an advisor, for instance, there are a number of reasons that they do so, but usually the first reason that would drive a student there is issues with the academic, their academic program. And sure enough, when we look at the surveys, there are two top reasons students start thinking about leaving university. And the first one is that fear of failure. They think they're not cut out for university. And the second one, which actually matches it almost 100%, is course load issues. So problems with course load, dealing with course load. That, of course, can present itself in many different ways for the student. Sometimes, and sometimes there's various and assorted reasons why they will feel a strain with their course loads. We do know students have difficulties, will have more financial difficulties than ever. So again, when we look at our trends of what students are reporting about why they might be thinking about leaving or what's worrying them, finances have grown remarkably as a reason of a source of anxiety or a source of thinking of leaving from 2019. So from the time of the pre-COVID, really. We saw the spike in finances around the time of COVID 2020, 2021. And it has come down somewhat, but not down as low as what we had seen in 2019 days. That's just one example of a factor that students are seeing. And that's important to understand. We look at, are you thinking of leaving because of family reasons or because you have a part-time job? That's lower. But if you start looking at the reasons, it gives you an opportunity to think about what your institution is doing to support that. So there's two ways we go about supporting. One is we put in place support. So there are student services or student affairs where students can go and seek. If you've got a disability, or if you're Maori or Pacific, where you might have some cultural needs you want met. Our LGBTQ plus cohort, there's supports for those students. But when you look across, even when you look at the cohort relative to where they come from and whether they're in the halls or not in the halls, those factors such as course load and fear of failure still come out at the top. So that helps us as a university to both put in, as I said, supports that focus on the student, but also to start to turn the mirror to ourselves and say, what is it that we can do to assist students, for instance, to ensure that they aren't staying in university longer than they need to, that they have success, that they're picking the right courses from the start so that they're not spending more time given the financial constraints and so on. So that's been the approach we've taken. It's very much a two-pronged approach about what are the institutional changes we can make to address some of our systemic barriers. Our aim is not to change the student or improve the student somehow. It's to look at the system and build in the success factors that we can make sure that they succeed.
It really made me think that there's two quite strong strains coming through. One is the well-being of the student, but also how that feeds into retention. The University of Canterbury has been around around for 150 years, I think. So you have a breadth of experience. How do universities keep their support services open to new needs and agile enough so that they can respond to, say, things like the pandemic or the results of it, perhaps an increase in mental health issues among students?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of ways. I think one of the important pieces and something University of Canterbury is quite committed to is really strong use of data. So having a look at the data, and that data can come in different ways. Some it's looking at how our students are performing, whether we're retaining them, are they getting through their degrees in a timely way? Are there barrier courses? So are there some courses that seem to be causing particular difficulties for students? So there's looking at that kind of data. There's the student voice data, as I mentioned. So the U count, which we release every year and run every year, so that allows us to see trends, gives us really invaluable information and quite quickly. We've taken a really proactive stance of democratizing the data, so making sure our staff can have good access to the data, making sure our students are getting feedback on what they're saying about themselves, and on closing the loop on some of that. So it helps us to make choices fairly quickly in response to what we're hearing from the students. And there are things that we don't recognize are causing issues for students sometimes and worries for students. But our student association, they're very proactive, our UCSA, and I meet with them regularly. I have a regular meeting with their executive. They also provide feedback. I do little podcasts with them and explain things from recording of lectures to how to deal with things with assignments. So it's very much about getting that feedback and then closing the loop.
And as part of that cross-institution communication that you're talking about, does this help you then make sure that you do have the right mix of support? So you mentioned protected characteristics or special groups like LGBTQ plus students or Pacific students. They, I imagine, have similar needs to the general student population. We all have things in common, but also things that are specific that might need particular services or expertise to make sure that they are succeeding.
Absolutely. So we can see, in addition to looking at trends about what might bother students or what they're experiencing, we do have as part of that survey, we look at what they value in the services, which services help them, what they value, and we can look at it relative to specific cohorts to see if there are some areas that we really need to focus our supports on. So for instance, we can see the supports that the students love and use the most and by cohort. So we can and we can see how often they're using it. But we can also have a look. For instance, we take a look at discrimination experiences that students might have. And again, we can look at that by cohort. But that can allow us to do a pan-university response. So if we're seeing discriminatory behaviors around that a particular group is dealing with, it's not just about helping that group learn to deal with that, but rather an education around the whole university and around our whole student body about discriminatory experiences and what people feel.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we do have to outreach to students. So there will be students who start to that there's a risk that they will get lost. So if you're having some major struggles with mental health, or major struggles with your finances or personal issues, or you've just become overwhelmed by maybe you've gotten behind and you've just become overwhelmed, we have created a proactive outreach tool called ACE, which stands for Analytics for Course Engagement. And the way that works is it uses data from the learning management system, and it basically looks at whether students are engaging with their activities on the learning management system. So our learning management system is called Learn, and everybody's course is up on Learn, and they have a group of activities through their course. They have things they need to read, which gets a low engagement score. They might have quizzes, which is a high engagement score. They might have discussions, which is also a high engagement score. And what ACE does is it uses machine learning, and it can see what the typical engagement is for that cohort at certain times. If somebody falls way below that typical engagement, they will get an automatic text reminder. When we first put it in place, which was a couple of years ago, 2020 actually, the text was quite generic and said things like, it looks like you've disengaged and from your course, or you haven't looked at Learn, and do you need any help? And we did at that stage, because we had some lockdowns during that stage, we did have students come back and say, yes, I desperately need help. I'm trying to do my work on a mobile phone, or so on. So we could then reach out, get resources to that student. Now what we've done over time, we've continued to develop it. And that first text alone used to get about 65% of students re-engaged. We've now personalized it further, and it's more specific to your course. So it will say, looks like you haven't been looking at your Econ 104. And just to let you know, there's a peer support group that happens at 2:00 on a Thursday, or if you need other supports, get in touch. So that has re-engaged about 75% of people without any other intervention. Sometimes the students will come back and say, oh, all good, I was just off for a bit. And sometimes we get ones that say, thanks, Mom. But sometimes we get people come back and ask for more help. Of the 25% who don't respond, we have a workflow that kicks in pretty quickly where we have a person then outreach. But it means we can put our resources, our people resources, into that 25% who really need much more intensive care. And sometimes it starts with an academic support, or the residential halls will reach out, and then it moves to our student care team, who really support particularly the mental health issues. So that's been a very helpful program in helping us to be more proactive and catch early our students who are in need.
So I'm hearing that there are levels to the support, beginning with peer-to-peer and more informal, right the way through to much more formal interventions. I wanted to pivot the conversation a little to ask you about resilience. So we've had the hurricanes in the US, and this had made me think that Christchurch had been through its own trauma with the earthquakes in 2010 and 2011. And I wanted to know how that affected the student body, whether that required extra support or counselling perhaps through that experience, and also whether it had changed the way that you communicated with students who might be dealing with large-scale trauma, like a natural disaster, but also perhaps more personal difficulties in their own lives.
Yes, at the time of the earthquake, and I was here during that time, and it was the second day of the first semester of the year, and the campus was packed. It was a beautiful day, and everything did change suddenly. At that stage, resilience just shone across the whole city. So everyone was in it together, which does, strangely, I think, helps, that there's a shared experience. And it really brought a community together. We had lots of support. Now, many of our students left at that stage, and some went. University of Adelaide was particularly responsive and said, look, we'll bring them, we'll welcome your students for a semester, and students got on a plane and went to Australia, not expecting to do that. So students responded remarkably. Within about a week or two, it would have been at least 2 weeks, I guess it was, following the earthquake, we had tents erected outside, great big tents, and our staff were teaching in tents, and our students were there learning in tents, and they were quite a unique cohort of very resilient, very strong students.
That's
I think
amazing.
where we started, yeah, it was amazing.
It
was
really
amazing.
is.
I think the shared experience helped a lot. I think we did see, though, across our young people who were younger at the time of the earthquake and coming through, across Christchurch, we did see, it was reported that there was quite a lot more anxiety from that cohort, from the cohort that we're about. They were sort of in primary school, early intermediate school, really did have some struggles as they went through. They were that little bit younger and probably still going through some of the challenges. But, the students have come through it. As I said, looking at the data, in fact, despite all that, when I looked at sort of 2019 data, students were still showing pretty good resilience across managing issues. And it was interesting because I think you see University of Canterbury and Lincoln University, which was also impacted at that time, when the pandemic hit, seemed to actually, I think we responded quite quickly and almost automatically, really, to the sudden changes of the pandemic. People were used to switching to how they had to deliver what they were doing. And again, it was that shared experience. So I think it helps to some degree having that shared experience. Certainly, the community, it was the hard thing with the earthquakes. People could go away and have a bit of a break from it. With the pandemic, of course, the whole globe was suffering with it and struggling with it. So it was different again. But I think our students are amazing, actually. And I think one of the things that has struck me in all the discussions about, our students, the different things they're dealing with now, the big flow of information. I think no wonder they struggle a little bit with managing course load, because the information flow, they get so much information from so many places. Despite that, I think the students are quite amazing and continue to teach us things as a sector, as a university. And I think one thing that hasn't changed, that has stayed steady in teaching, and it's back to Vygotsky, is the student, wherever the student is, it's on us to then move to the next level, to teach them, to bring them to the next level wherever they are. So I think I keep that at the forefront of my mind when I'm thinking about both the supports we need to put in place, whether we need to change how we're teaching, whether we need to look at, if students are that overwhelmed with course loads and so on, is it because we're providing too much information? Are we providing a good example? I'll share an example if you don't mind. Our analytics course engagement also has a teacher-facing dashboard. So the teachers, the faculty, the teaching staff can see what the students are engaging in. And there was a time, a long time ago, not that long ago, actually, that, you got all your information from sitting in the lecture. That's where you got the information. And maybe or you go to the library and look up something. But most of your information came from that hour in the lecture. Whereas now, with learning management systems and everything else, they suddenly have a huge amount of information. So one of our award-winning teachers looked at his ACE dashboard to see what the students were looking at, and he realized he had a recognition that he had actually overwhelmed them with too much information. So he had put YouTube videos on and all kinds of things to supplement their learning, but he realized they didn't really know where to look. They weren't quite sure how to focus what they were doing because it was too much information. So he was able to adapt and change and say, make sure they were directed in what he wanted them to really focus on, and provide that extra information at the right times. So it gives us a challenge as well along the way, but I think all of those things matter to where our students are at.
Yeah, absolutely. And what kind of professional development or support is available for staff?
Yeah, we have a range of supports for staff, and I think it's a challenge for them as well around managing workloads, actually. Because again, there was a time when your main thing was to go and deliver the lecture and do your research and maybe support in the lab, whereas now you're doing much more. It's pastoral, but also just supporting students in general. So we have lots of workshops for staff, both around academic support and redesigning your assessment, so that kind of thing, to manage a curriculum so that it's not so overwhelming. But we also have a number of workshops for staff around coaching conversations and around when to refer, recognizing students in distress and so on. But we do try to put some supports around them as well by things like ACE, where we have a team that can respond in the first instance, or they can, if they have any concerns, if the teaching staff have any concerns, they can get in touch. We know that our students often do like to hear from the faculty and their discipline themselves. So we had an example where we had some issues with cheating and plagiarism around the time of the lockdown. So there was a whole lot of work we actually had to do with that cohort and across the staff, both to address the cheating, but also the students became very anxious about it because they were uncertain about whether it really was cheating and so on. And what we found was they didn't want to be sent, say, to student care to manage their anxiety. They wanted some reassurance from the academic staff that, yeah, this was a mistake. Yeah, you've got, we're in a new environment and things are not usual, but this is how you can rectify it, and so on and so forth. So there is a constant need to keep an eye on where the information's coming from. And we don't have that nailed yet, but it's something we're constantly looking at.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can imagine actually that having that reassurance that of what the academic parameters are and whether or not you've breached them would be reassuring in a way that connects quite deeply to the students.
They weren't feeling any better going and getting some support external to their discipline. They really needed it there. So it was an interesting lesson for all of us.
I can see that. So that's a great piece of advice. I just wondered if you had any others tidbits to share with us based on your experiences, or perhaps another successful initiative at UC in terms of providing effective safeguarding for your student community.
I think the data is important because it does help you move with what's actually happening. We do find that the students who are in halls do have generally better kinds of supports and wraparounds. So I guess the last thing would be we put in place something called peer-assisted learning support. PALS, which is the students, the PALS leaders actually are paid to take the course again. They don't have to do the assessments, but they take the course again so they can hear exactly what the students are hearing at the time. And they run sessions for the students. They're put in the timetable, so the student doesn't have to try and find another space for them. They're all timetabled relative to their course and program. And we found that has been very successful, both in terms of the academic piece. So our data is showing that students who attend PALS actually perform at least one grade point average above their matched peers. But also it helps the social. We find that students who maybe don't want to join clubs or are having to travel, maybe they're traveling across town or they have a job in the evening, they don't have time to maybe do some of the other social, can get a bit more social activity there. It's not a tutorial, so nobody's teaching them. It's a discussion, and it's an opportunity to ask questions and sometimes get tips, study kind of tips and so on. And that's been a really successful program.
That sounds like a fantastic idea.
Those PALS leaders will say things like, one posted out to the group on Facebook or Discord saying, oh, I remember this lecture last year and I really found it confusing and this is how I dealt with it. I actually read this piece in the text or in the article and that really helped me. And then what do you think? And what are some ideas you've gotten from that? And so people, it's again that fear of failure thing. So what we find in those early weeks is students will attribute any kind of difficulties and potential failures to themselves. So they think, I'm not cut out for this because I missed the quiz, when actually there was something about the way the quiz had been set up that made it easy to miss. So, or the students will think, I really have no idea what's going on. But these peer-assisted learning support leaders can say, I remember this from last year. I didn't have a clue what was happening. Don't panic. This is how I got through it. That's been really powerful.
Yes, I imagine. That is also a really powerful note for us to finish this conversation. Catherine, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really terrific hearing about what's going on at UC.
That's it for this week. If you want to find more advice and insight on how universities can keep their students and staff safe, we have published a spotlight collection with resources contributed by higher education professionals all over the world. You'll find it at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we will speak to you again in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.